argue that World War II started as early as 1931 in Asia. However, if the qualification of a world war from Merriam-Webster Dictionary is a war engaged in by all or most of the principal nations of the world, conflict in 1931 cannot qualify as a world war. Without the principal powers in Europe being engaged in a war, as well as conflicts occurring elsewhere, a war cannot be qualified as a world war, but rather it was a regional conflict.
Since Britain and France had control over colonies all around the world, their formal declaration of war helps us come up with a reference point as to when the Second World War began. So, due to the involvement of these two powers and their colonies worldwide against Germany, as well as this being a formal declaration of war rather than simply another cause for it, we've come to the conclusion that the most widely accepted date, September 1st of 1939, is the most reasonable start of World War II.
The most important factor that caused World War II was expansionism. In general, expansionism inevitably caused conflict around borders. If there was no protest from the home country when expansionism occurred, then there was no war. But anytime civil populations opposed the forceful control of the area, a conflict arose and a localized war broke out. This was common in the inter-year wars as Japan, Germany, and Italy all became more expansionist throughout the 1920s and 30s. In Italy, Mussolini became president in 1922 and led the country in a fascist direction. His policy was set on the revitalization of Italy after they had not been granted the territories promised to them in the 1915 Treaty of London and had suffered some humiliation from that. One of his goals was known to be wanting to revitalize Italy to the Roman power it once was. However, this required the expansion of Italian territory as the Roman Empire used to be huge. Both in the occupation of Corfu, Greece, Albania, which was protectorate, and Abyssinia, these occupations all caused some level of armed conflict, tested the League of Nations, and alarmed other countries. In continuation, expansionism was also prevalent in Asia, with the aggression stemming from Japan, felt the need to have more land and more resources, with the Great Depression greatly limiting their trade. They also wanted to be a respected power on the world stage. Earlier, Japan had annexed Korea, taken German Pacific colonies at the end of World War I, and significantly, Japan also invaded Manchuria during the interwar years, which started a Sino-Japanese War from 1931 onward.
As well, after economic instability from the Great Depression and lingering humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles made more present by Keynes' public orthodox view, the German people wanted to have a government that was strong and decisive. This resulted in the rise of fascism in Germany and governments who adopted an increasingly expansionist foreign policy. This was an integral cause of World War II, since when Hitler began to act on this foreign policy by annexing the Sudetenland and soon Czechoslovakia after Britain's policy of appeasement failed to prevent this, the ensuing tension in the rest of Europe ultimately led to a level of strain which was bound to boil over in the near future, which is why the long-term factor of expansionism is our most important point rather than any singular short-term event.
The next most important factor that caused World War II is the Great Depression. Germany was one of the hardest hit countries from the Great Depression. The lack of world trade in combination with the heavy reparations from the Treaty of Versailles put Germany in a difficult spot. Many Germans wanted change in how the country was run. Hitler's Nazi Party benefited greatly and gained significant votes during this period. In 1930, they received 107 seats in the parliament, and in 1932, they received 230 seats. He took his opportunities when Germany was struggling, and he greatly increased his power during this time. In 1932, the Nazis were the largest political party in Germany. Hitler became chancellor because President Paul von Hindenburg appointed him. He chose Hitler because he had sufficient support to govern. This support was gained from the desperation the people were placed in during the Great Depression. Hence, the Great Depression led directly to Hitler becoming chancellor in the Weimar Republic. Hitler, as an individual being placed in power, became responsible for many conflicts during the Second World War. The Great Depression also severely affected France and the UK. As with the rest of the world, both had economically suffered, leading them to focus on rebuilding their own economies and solving their internal problems instead of focusing on foreign issues. This was present throughout the 30s. When Hitler came to power, France and the UK did not want to fight a war, which would lead to further conflict. The Great Depression was also important because it was truly worldwide. Japan, another world power, had its trade with other countries reduced. Therefore, Japan lost access to many raw materials. To compensate for this, they decided to increase their territory in order to gain more resources, later leading to the invasion of Manchuria and other attacks in Asia. Therefore, the effect the Great Depression had on Japan truly increased the hostilities in Asia, which then would become significant during World War II.
The failure of appeasement as a foreign policy against Hitler's expansionism is the third most important factor in causing World War II. After World War I and the devastation it caused, there was quite reasonably a desire to prevent another war from breaking out across Europe. According to these wishes from the general public, as well as the economic weakness across the Allied powers after the First World War and the Great Depression, this was attempted by implementing the foreign policy of appeasement, aimed at satiating Germany's aggressive expansionist motives. Starting from 1935, Hitler was already beginning to act in violation of the terms set in the Treaty of Versailles. Military conscription and expansion was a sign that he was ready to carry out his intention to rearm, retake, and grow the German Empire. In March of 1936, in a clear violation of the Treaty of Locarno, Germany marched to remilitarize the Rhineland on its west border by France and Belgium. Neither France nor Britain took action against this violation when they had the chance to. When Hitler then threatened war in 1938, unless the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia was surrendered, Britain and France continued to follow the values of appeasement in the hopes that Hitler would stay true to his word from the Munich Agreement so that total war could be avoided. Less than a year later, on March 15th of 1939, he seized the rest of Czechoslovakia completely. This, along with Hitler's rampage of annexation and occupation that followed, such as taking Memel in Lithuania, demanding the free city of Danzig, and raising demands for Poland, was the catalyst for Britain and France to finally come to the reality that appeasement was not effective for their situation, and that at that point war was going to break out across Europe no matter how long they tried to delay it. This was ultimately what caused them to make an agreement with Poland in 1939 to ensure its protection. And something similar would have happened eventually, if not that specific event, due to the bottling up of a situation that could have most effectively been nipped at its roots. So, after all that, why isn't the failure of appeasement one of our top most important causes of World War II? Well, unlike our first two arguments, appeasement didn't directly affect very many powers globally, such as those in Asia and other nations in Europe, for that matter. Its main implementation was by the British and partially the French towards Germany, which doesn't fully lead to the conclusion of a world war like Megan outlined. But appeasement was very significant in letting Germany, specifically, get opportunities to seek out conflict and keep its annexed lands. Because Germany's actions during the interwar years were extremely important, as it can generally be agreed upon that it was Germany's aggressive actions and expansionism that instigated the extent of the tension and conflict in Europe that contributed to the start of a war there, we still place appeasement relatively higher in significance.
The fourth most important factor that caused World War II was the failure of the League of Nations. The collapse of the League was significant, but less so than other factors already mentioned. The League of Nations was created with the purpose of maintaining peace as an international board to solve conflicts. It is clear that the League was not successful in this task, as World War II did break out in 1939. Although the League had the intention to provide pressure to aggressors, it failed to put any significant restrictions when aggression was taken by a country. Even in the early years of the League, it failed with the 1920 Polish seizure of Vilna, Lithuania, which even after the League's declaration that Poland should withdraw, Poland maintained occupation. As well, the League failed with the Polish-Soviet War of 1920 to 1921 and the Greco-Turkish War in 1920, which were also not prevented by the League. Nor was Italy's seizure of Corfu in 1923. Many failures continued into the Mukden incident, where Japan eventually withdrew from the League in 1933, as a result that everyone in the League voted against them for their 1931 occupation of Manchuria. Furthermore, Germany also left the League in 1933 after the League refused to accept its bid to build military equal to other powers. However, the League was somewhat successful in disarmament, but rather insignificantly, as most countries did keep most of their arms, which, when the arms race towards World War II began, didn't help the proximity of the war. It is also worth noting that the League of Nations collapsed in 1935 when it failed to stop the second conflict between major countries of the League. Italy invaded Abyssinia and then receded from the League after economic sanctions were put on it. All three of the withdrawals from the League of Germany, Italy, and Japan showed the end of international collaboration against aggression. Instead of maintaining the peace, the League couldn't enforce their policy and instead sparked hostility of Japan, Germany, and Italy against the Western powers, of which you can see in World War II later with the Rome-Berlin Axis of 1936 and the alliances with Japan. With this all said, the collapse of the League was not the most significant cause of the war, as there was still 4 years between its collapse and the declaration of war itself, but the failure of peace measures did play a role in the eventual beginning of World War II.
On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. The German occupation of Poland was a turning point in Europe, and it was a short-term cause that directly contributed towards the beginning of World War II. The UK would respond with air raids above Germany. Although they initially only dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, by September 4th they would begin bombing German ships, indicating that this invasion was more significant than Germany's prior invasions of Czechoslovakia or of Austria. Before this invasion, Chamberlain had believed the conflict could be resolved diplomatically. However, the invasion of Poland caused war to be inevitable. The involvement of the UK and France also brought their colonies, which existed around the world, into the war. The involvement from them quickly made the war global, and it began affecting more places. While invading Poland in 1939, Germany had begun opening forced labor camps in which prisoners of war, civilians, were sent to live in brutal conditions. The camps went against the Geneva Convention of 1929, thereby showing the great lengths that the Nazis would go to win war, and it showed that war had completely begun. Although there was a direct link between the invasion of Poland and the start of the Second World War, there are reasons why it is not as significant as the other causes of war. Firstly, this invasion was almost entirely affecting Europe. Asia, Africa, and the Americas were not majorly affected by this invasion. The conflict between Japan and China was still unrelated to this conflict in Europe. Secondly, the main reason the invasion of Poland is not as important is that without the other long-term factors, the invasion would not have occurred. It was the tipping point which led to war, but it would not have been the cause of war without all the other long-term causes occurring.